This episode is generously sponsored by Karen and George Goldberg in honor of their children and 3 grandchildren who are all descendants of Karen's mom, Ilona Medweed, a Holocaust survivor and the inspiration for this podcast, and also in honor of George's dad, Staff Sergeant Frederick Goldberg of the U.S. Army Air Force, who flew 35 missions as a B-17 side gunner fighting the Nazis. I once ran into her in the gift shop at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. She was very easy to spot. She was a diminutive woman who spoke with a German accent that anyone would recognize. I introduced myself, she introduced herself, we exchanged pleasantries. It was all lovely. And then a few years later, I was in the lobby of the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I saw her again, and I reintroduced myself to her. Whether or not she really remembered me, she acted as if she remembered me. And then she asked me a few questions about how I was doing. And for some reason, I told her that I had become newly single again. And then her eyes sparkled. And I could tell that she would have given me advice if only I had asked for it. I am talking about the late Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Welcome to our podcast, To Be Continued. Reflections on growing up with Holocaust survivors, where we explore the intersections of memory, identity, and resilience. Our goal is to lift up the experiences of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and to ask, how did those memories form you? How did resilience create you as the person you are today? And what is the legacy that you will leave to those who come after you? I'm your host, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. And because this episode comes out in the beginning of April, which means it's coming out very close to Yom HaShoah, its relevance is particularly poignant. Before Dr. Ruth became a cultural icon, she was Carola Ruth Siegel, a Jewish child in Nazi Germany who escaped under Kindertransport, a rescue effort that saved thousands of Jewish children from Nazi Europe. She lost her parents in the Holocaust, and she grew up as an orphan in Switzerland. Ruth would become an Israeli soldier. She would come to the United States. She would earn a doctorate. And eventually, as you know, she would go on to become one of the world's most recognizable and authoritative voices, talking openly about sex, relationships, and human intimacy. Today's guest is Leora Einleger. She is the very proud granddaughter of Dr. Ruth K. Westheimer, may her memory be a blessing, whom she calls Omi, who was a self-described orphan of the Holocaust. Leora had a blessing, a rare blessing, which was to have Omi in her life for 28 years. And I will say that Omi's story of survival, resilience, and joy had a major impact and influence on Leora's career and personal pursuits. She is a New York attorney, and she focuses on commercial litigation and white-collar defense and investigations. In her Omi's memory, Leora maintains an active pro bono practice which focuses on reproductive rights and combating antisemitism. Leora represents the 3rd generation descendants, carrying forward both the memory of that loss during the Holocaust and the extraordinary story of resilience that emerged from it. Before we go any further, I want to remind everyone that this is Women's History Month. And we think of all the women who have made history. And when I think of those history-making women, near the top of my list is Dr. Ruth. And it's not only because of the fact that she grew up carrying grief and displacement and the weight of survival. That's just one piece of it. But we remember her specifically because she refused to let loss determine her future and define who she was. And she used her life to help others to live more fully and honestly. And with that, welcome, Leora. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're going to talk about the details of your Omi's life and your relationship with her, but let's just start by asking, what was it like growing up with Dr. Ruth?
It was the best experience ever. I had the best grandmother in the world. She was way cooler than I ever will be, went out more than I did, had more friends than I did, and really was one of my closest friends. I was lucky to grow up close to her. I saw her at least once a week. When I was older, we spoke almost every day. Um, just beyond lucky. I think a lot of people ask me, did she talk to me about sex? Not really. I think that was something she separated her home life and work life. And it was really impactful always seeing people stop her on the street when we were together. There were sort of two categories. Either people would stop her wanting a picture, and she would often oblige and then say, but today I'm just Leora's Omi, so I'm not Dr. Ruth for the day. And other times, there would often be gay men in their middle age who would stop her and mention how her support and outreach during the AIDS epidemic saved their life. And that was something that really stuck with me during all of my childhood. And I think not enough people know about her advocacy in that area.
It's a very powerful memory. How old were you when you found out about your Omi's Holocaust story? And I'm just wanting to know whether uh, you could tell us about what you know about her first experiences when the war broke out, uh, Kristallnacht in her hometown of Frankfurt, Germany. What can you tell us?
Yeah. So my Omi, I think first of all, I have to say that she is definitely my most well-known relative, but there were also survivors and orphans of the Holocaust on both sides. But she was the grandparent I grew up with. So that's whose story I know and the public knows. Um, I remember sort of first understanding that she was a Holocaust survivor or orphan of the Holocaust, as she says, when I noticed that she didn't have family like other people did. My mom's side was small, and I was trying to figure out why that was. So, for a little background on my Omi, she was born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, and had a wonderful, happy childhood until she was 10 and a half when the Nazis came, took her father away. Her mom, she lived with her mom and grandmother and father. They, luckily, she doesn't know exactly how, but got her on a transport, sent her to Switzerland. She really did not want to go, but knew somehow that that was what was best for her. She was sent to Switzerland and lived there for 7 years in an orphanage where she was very much treated like a second class citizen. Her job was to take care of the Swiss Jewish kids in the orphanage. She then moved to then Palestine, fought in the Haganah, lived in Israel, then moved to Paris, and then finally came to New York.
What a rich life. Did she ever tell you what it was like for her and how she felt about leaving her entire family during the war? And when she did that, how did it make you feel?
Yeah, it was a big part of my growing up was knowing that at a 10-year-old had to leave her family for good. She had such a happy childhood. She talks about having roller skates and her dad on the way to synagogue on Friday night bringing just enough money to get her an ice cream on the way there so he wouldn't be carrying money on Shabbat. And she just had really an ideal childhood. Um, the strength it must have taken as a 10-year-old to leave your family. She was told by them, we'll get you, we'll see you, which they did think was true, but they were all murdered. I remember in fourth grade when I was 10 and a half years old, I drew a picture of myself as my grandma because I thought, you know what, I'm safe now. I made it past 10 and a half years. I still have my family. So it was really part of my childhood since the beginning.
Your Omi spent 6 years in Switzerland without any family. When the war ended, she was an orphan. She's 16 years old. She leaves Switzerland and she goes to British occupied mandatory Palestine. And she doesn't come to the United States. Why? Why does she go to Israel? And what does she do in Israel? And why did she eventually come here anyway?
Zionism was so core to my grandmother's identity. She felt after the Holocaust and seeing what had happened to her family that Jews needed a homeland. She saw that also in Switzerland, where she wasn't treated. She's thankful that they saved her life, but she wasn't treated very well. She was a maid. She wasn't given an education. She had to take books from friends at night to study. And what she saw in the creation of Israel was a safe place for Jews, like many survivors and orphans of Holocaust. So I don't even know if it occurred to her to think about going to the United States. Really, Israel was what mattered. And she wanted to be part of the nation building. And, most of her life revolved around creating community and creating family. Hers was taken away at such a young age. She does credit her parents with her success in life as giving her such a happy, fulfilling childhood. But she did lose them early on. So her life revolved around creation of home and family. And that's what she went to Israel to do. She went to create a Jewish homeland.
You are a proclaimed Zionist. We have that in common. And I'm wondering how the story of your Omi fighting in the Haganah might have influenced your strong connection to Israel and the way you identify yourself as a Zionist.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it started with my mom. My mom also served in the IDF. When my mom decided after college to move to Israel, my Omi would say, I wanted you to be a Zionist, but maybe not that much of a Zionist that you have to get up and move across the world. Eventually, my dad brought my mom back, and they live in New York. But I decided after high school to spend a year in Israel. I took a gap year. And after college, I worked at an organization that was a feminist Zionist organization, very much aligned with what my grandmother believed. It was just part of her story, Zionism. It wasn't separate from it. That was where she was able to sort of continue her development and to some extent rehabilitation after the Holocaust. So, I have so much family there and friends, and it's absolutely an important part of my identity because of her.
I want to go back just for a moment to the Kinder Transport. The Kinder Transport Association, and I quote, says that the Kinder Transport children are survivors, although they escaped to the UK and other countries between 1938 and 1940. They suffered the trauma of losing their homes. They were separated from their families, many of whom perished. They lived in fear. But I also understand that your Omi didn't consider herself a survivor. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. She would correct people who called her a survivor. It was really important to her. I think it was honestly giving respect and honor in a way to people who did go to camps. She felt like she was lucky in the situation. And maybe she survived the situation. She did not feel comfortable calling herself a survivor. That sort of goes to her general attitude of just sort of appreciation and never wanting too much um, self focus, maybe in certain ways. In some ways, she loved being the center of attention. Um, but with her story, her Holocaust story, I think she tried to minimize her role as much as she was saved by the Swiss, and the US took her in, the Kinder Transport, all these things are sort of what happened to her. I think Survivor puts her a little bit too much at the center of the story in a way that she wasn't comfortable. It's funny comparing it to her career, she very much was at the center, but in this way, she wasn't.
In my life and in my career, I've known many survivors. As a matter of fact, I forgot to mention another link to your Omi. A number of years ago, I interviewed to be the rabbi of Hebrew Tabernacle Congregation in Washington Heights. She was still alive then. She was the honorary president. And people, even at that interview, talked about how funny she was. She was always upbeat. And in my experience of knowing survivors, there are two categories emotionally. There are those who are dour and dark and haunted for every right reason. And then there's your grandmother. There's your Omi, who was always positive, upbeat. It permeated her public persona, no doubt her private persona. Where'd she get that from?
It's funny, she could not understand a joke for the life of her if you told her, a joke, but she was so funny. And one thing that was very special for me was my husband had a really unique relationship with her where they had inside jokes. Something I don't think my grandma even knew what that meant, but they really had just a fun time together. She was hilarious. Um, a lot of it, I think, stemmed from her wanting to turn her life into something from nothing and recognizing, like you said, two really legitimate ways that survivors cope. For her to wallow in that, it just wasn't, I don't think she would have survived in that way. That just, it was too much for her to bear. I never saw my grandma cry. My mom maybe once saw her cry. And it's possible she did this on her own time. She made a reference to that in a documentary about her, that processing her past is that way. But her humor and her constant filling of conversation and constant focus of positive attributes of people, and everything was happy and positive. I think that was her way to survive. And I think that's also what attracted people to her, because her small petite size, her accent, and also this just like exuberant, happy person who just sees so much joy in the world is something we all could benefit from.
Now, your mother and uncle are second generation. Your brother, third generation. I'm curious. So you've got this family, obviously a loving family. How did your Omi's story, how did her past shape the atmosphere of your family?
I think a bunch of her values definitely shaped our family. First, I would say education. That was the most important thing to her, starting because she was denied an education when she was in the Swiss orphanage. She used to think it was so funny. She'd laugh, hee hee hee, that she was able to get a PhD and never had a high school diploma. She was not given an education that she wanted. She said she had wanted to be a doctor when she was growing up, a medical doctor. So she was a doctor in a different way. But that was most important. And she prioritized that for my mom when she was a single mom raising my mother, put her in the best school she could find. I don't know how she afforded it. Um, Same with me and my cousins. I'm now a lawyer. I was in law school when my grandmother died, and my cousin Michal is a doctor. She's about to graduate from med school. I think it meant so much to her, specifically that her granddaughters were getting advanced degrees. Education just played such an important. She actually, my grandmother died 2 weeks before I took the bar exam. And leading up to that, I would go and visit her. And education was so important that she would smile. She knew I was there, and she would say, "Go home and study." It was just at the forefront of everything. She also had this infectious appreciation for life. I mean, you could get her mashed potatoes from a diner, and it's the best thing she ever had. We once got her a crepe from a place upstate, and she talked about it for 2 years. She just appreciated things in a way nobody does. And then her energy. I mean, I once yawned in front of her, and that was not acceptable. There was no yawning, there was no laziness. You get up, you support yourself, you learn. I think that's how she lived so long and so well. It surely wasn't the mashed potatoes and the gummy bears she would eat all the time.
So how did that form your identity, personally and professionally?
I mean, I think a lot to this day about what Omi would do. When I think about career opportunities and personal growth, and I actually, in the middle of law school, was panicking, and I thought, oh, I shouldn't have come to law school. I should have been a therapist. And I called my Omi and told her this and said, what if I had just taken over from you? What if I had continued the legacy? And she quickly said to me, oh, you would not have been a good therapist, first of all. And second of all, I think what your skill set fits best with is with the law, and the impact you can make on people the most is through the law. So I do think about, the ways she was able to impact people and how I can do it in my own way. And I think just sort of a general, my whole family, you think about how would Omi have handled this situation? It's not always maybe how you want to handle a situation, but it's always taking every opportunity, supporting everyone, and just appreciation for everything.
I want to darken things just a little bit. There have been several times over the last few years, and I'm not saying this just because we're talking about her, but there are times when I've wondered how Dr. Ruth and other people of her generation who went through the experiences of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, what they would think about this great darkness that we're encountering now in America and in the world, which is the rise of anti Semitism. She spoke passionately so often about the need to combat the rise of anti Semitism, and she had a very special way of understanding it. She understood it as an obligation, that we have an obligation to the memory of those who were killed. And she once said that her grandchildren, i.e., you, represent, here's the quote, small victories in the continuing struggle against evil, especially the evil of anti Semitism. I once said to a child who was the grandchild of a survivor when I did her bat mitzvah ceremony, I said, "You are the fist that we shake in the face of Hitler." And so I'm wondering, in the years since she died, especially since October 7th, it's not only that anti Semitism has grown, but Holocaust denial, distortion has surged. I know that you've worked in Washington. You've prepared briefings on anti Semitism for the staffers of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What would she say today about what's going on?
We were relieved in a way that my grandma wasn't totally aware of October 7th. Um, I could not handle the thought of her understanding exactly what happened. She knew there was an attack, but she wasn't watching the news anymore. We didn't lie to her ever. When she had questions, my mom would tell her, but we didn't voluntarily share information. It hurt me so much to think about her and the survivors and orphans who would see that happen, especially to their beloved country and to fellow Jews. I think she was thinking about Holocaust denial and Holocaust fatigue way before many others. This was something she'd been talking about for 10 years. She really saw it ahead of time. I think what's so important for her is that we continue to bear witness and use education, which was, as I said, so important to her, to make sure that we don't allow this sort of denial and fatigue. Part of my education in it was I went on March of the Living when I was in high school, and I read her biography during the trip and was the first person in my family to go visit Auschwitz since her father was murdered there. So it was so important for her that I did that too, even as somebody who didn't have this sort of denial or fatigue, to really bear witness and understand. So that was key.
I'm wondering, in addition, uh, how has this formed your identity as a Jew, as a professional? I'm wondering if she metaphorically sits with you every day at your desk.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, metaphorically, and I have a sign on my desk that says "It can be done," which was on her desk every day. Um, it's very ugly looking, but it needed to be there because it was exactly what my grandma, that was her attitude, and it so much reminds me of her. I try and use that as a guide always. She loved saying done when something was done. She wanted everything done immediately. She was very impatient, but impatient in a good way, not wanting to drag things out, wanting change to happen. I decided to go to law school because I wanted originally to pursue reproductive justice and rights work, and I'm still able to do that right now. And that was from her. I mean, I learned about the impacts of lack of access to reproductive health, reproductive education because of her. And that was really my career pursuit originally. I've since developed also into doing work in antisemitism, doing legal work there, also directly related to her. And I really, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about her and miss her and hope that she'd be happy and proud with what I'm doing in her memory and the career choices and life I lead.
It's so interesting to me meeting you this way, hearing you talk about your story and your life. It's almost as if there are two rivers that issued forth from your Omi's life. There was a river of intimacy, of caring deeply about, let me just be honest about the body and about how the body works and how the soul interacts with the body. And then there was this abiding sense of justice. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you feel a responsibility, an obligation to carry forth this legacy?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great characterization. I think she saw them as related though, that the intimacy and those instructions were important because it reflected wider societal justice and what was right and education and teaching people respect. And, again, I think it so impacted where I am. Um, and I think my grandmother, I think she saw things a lot maybe differently or more connected than we might. When she talked about the AIDS crisis or something specific in like the sexual world. Like she saw this all and the humor and the Talmud, she saw it all as interconnected in a way that I think is hard to understand, for me at least. But that really resonated with people and is something I always strive to emulate.
It's very funny to me knowing the Jewish world and its psychological geography the way I do. Your Omi was a German Jew. German Jews are different. I'm just trying to think of the Victorian attitudes she must have inhaled, even as a small child, that she had to transcend in order to do the work that she did.
And the way she describes it, and I think is accurate, is because she lost her family and because of her experience in the Holocaust, she needed this connection. That's how she got into this work. She was researching and writing about survivors of the Holocaust and what happened to them. The group with her on the kinder transport. She wrote about why none of them committed suicide or were otherwise, really suffering, that all of them made lives for themselves. And her reason, she says, was because of the connection and support they had for each other. So I think that's sort of, I mean, she definitely was a yucca in so many ways, but that's sort of what brought her. It was that experience in the kinder transport, creating community in the orphanage, on kibbutz in Israel, all the way to America. That's where her career stemmed from, was human connection. And she saw that as very related to sexuality. So to her, I don't think it's as much of a jump as we might see from German Jew to sex therapy expert.
No, because what intervened there was something very powerful. Whenever I used to encounter her on television through her writings, I kept on thinking of the injunction in the book of Deuteronomy as we get to the very end of the Torah, where Moses says that God has placed before us blessing and curse, life and death. Therefore, choose life. She chose life and she went into a field that was the most life affirming field that you can imagine.
Yeah. She had post-its and signs all around her house that said joie de vivre. I'm definitely not pronouncing it the way she would, but just the joy of life. That was so her. She just had joy and excitement in such mundane things. And exactly that relates to sexuality and her pursuit of connection and support of people. She, at the end of her life, really focused on loneliness. She was appointed the ambassador of loneliness for the state of New York, something she convinced the governor to create for her. And that also related to this. I think people sometimes questioned, what does that have to do with sexuality? And she said everything. It's craving connection. And she really saw loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness we have now as a natural extension of her work.
I'm so grateful to you that you mentioned that because I like to think metaphorically. I'm wondering to what extent she saw her work in combating loneliness as a continuation of her own life mission. We are a lonely people, and she experienced the radical loneliness of the Jewish people at its most vulnerable time.
She experienced both Jewish peoplehood loneliness and I think a personal loneliness that's really hard to fathom. Being a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old alone in a country, treated as a maid, stopping, she used to get letters from her parents. It stopped at one point. She didn't want to go there and think what that meant, but she sort of knew what that meant. She talks about in her diaries, which are discussed in documentary about her, she was alone in the world. She really had no one. And I think that absolutely is a natural extension of her work. And she began to really focus on the loneliness as she got older. I was always concerned, is she lonely? Is that why she's focusing on this right now? I think she could be surrounded by everybody in the world, but there would always be some sort of loneliness given her past and what happened to her that almost wasn't quenchable. But human sexuality and connection was sort of the way she filled it as much as possible.
Sometimes I think about her in contrast to, with no judgment implied, her neighbor up in Washington Heights, in what we used to call the Fourth Reich, a heavily German Jewish neighborhood. You could see the movie in the Heights, the musical. That's that's about the Dominican side of the Heights. It kind of erases the west of Broadway German Jewish side of the Heights. I think of her neighborhood, Heinz Henry Kissinger, and how they grew up in the same area, and yet they were so very different in many ways.
Yeah, she debated him at one point, or made some. I don't remember what it was exactly, but she had some comment about immigrants, and she said, we were orphans, we were immigrants, and you should know better, basically.
Wow. So as we move towards our end, I just want to underscore something for you and for our listeners. When I look back on the life and the career of Dr. Ruth Westheimer, your Omi, I think it is fair to say that for the large portion of her career that was in the public eye, she was, think of this for a moment, the most visible survivor of the Holocaust in America.
Yeah, and
Which makes me ask go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, and it didn't change her, which is what amazed me. She lived in the same. She died in the same apartment that she raised my mom and uncle in. It didn't change. The fame didn't change her. If she was driven somewhere to some fancy event, she'd make sure to get the driver's number, call his mom to say hi, invite him in. That was such a crucial part of her. And I hope everybody knows that about her, that it just did not change her. Nothing did. She wore my shoes from fourth grade, my Merrills, for maybe 10 years late after. Nothing changed her. She stayed who she was. And yeah, I think she was a visible survivor, and that was important to her. But so was it was equally important for her to be known for connection and for happiness.
I think you're absolutely right. Obviously, the late, lamented, often cited moral witness of our time, Elie Wiesel of blessed memory, certainly was massively present, massively visible to the American public. But your grandmother had a regular television show and a media presence that really would have been the envy, really, of anyone. So let me ask the final question. If your grandmother could give one message to your generation and the generations to come, about resilience and joy, what do you think it would be?
I think it would be the importance of finding joy in daily life, no matter how small. And I think it would be that family can be made from nothing. You can create your own family biologically or not. When things are taken away from you, it's not the end, and something can always come out of nothing.
It's a powerful message. And what a blessing you had. We're all blessed to have our grandparents, and yours gave you a unique blessing, which I can tell has a way of reverberating every day on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
We'd like to thank our new friend, Leora Einleger, for joining us today. This episode is a production of the 2G, 3G project, produced and edited by Ellie Hershko, and it's co-directed by our podcast founder, Cheryl Hoffman. And once again, I'm your host, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. Now, you can find the To Be Continued podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Audible, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you believe that these 2G and 3G voices are important, you can support us in several different ways. First, hit the follow button. This way you won't miss an episode. Second, please help us spread the word. Please share an episode with friends and family and on your social media pages. And third, would you please consider supporting this podcast? We are a fiscally sponsored nonprofit, so we rely on donors and their generosity and their vision to help us keep producing our show. Please contact us at info at capital T2, capital BB, capital C continued, capital P podcast.org. Info at to be continued podcast.org. Until next month, thank you for your support. Thank you for listening.